chapter 3, and we'll be focusing on verses 1 through 15. Before I do that, let's do just catch us up for those who haven't been here. But even before that, let me just pray. Our Lord and our God, we praise you, O Lord. We praise you because you are worthy to be praised. We ask, O Lord, that you might help us tonight, that you might help me to open up your word, to teach your word. I pray, O Lord, that I would teach with clarity, that you would pierce the hearts of us here and now, O Lord. I hope that you would help us to be attentive, to dig into your word, and to ask, O Lord, that you would help us to apply the truths that we see in your word, O God. I do praise you for those who have come out, and I thank you, O Lord. Know, O Lord, that it is your Spirit that is at work within us, O God. So I ask that you would just help us. Pray this in Christ's name. All right, so we're in the book of Ruth. Ruth is right after the book of Judges. I think most of you guys have been here for the last couple of studies that we've been in the book of Ruth, but for those who haven't or are unfamiliar with the book of Ruth, Ruth is obviously a woman, and the whole book of Ruth is kind of it's climbing up to the climax, which is in chapter 3, which is where we're going to be focusing on. But before that, Ruth is a widow. She is the daughter-in-law of a woman named Naomi, and Naomi was married to a man named Elimelech. And Elimelech and Naomi, they lived in Bethlehem, and there was a great famine in Bethlehem. And so Elimelech, the husband, decides to move to Moab to flee the famine so that he won't die of starvation. And shortly after, we see in the verses in chapter 1 that Elimelech ends up dying in Moab. He gets to Moab just to die. And we spoke on how his decision affected him and his family. Instead of trusting in the Lord during the famine, he instead flees and goes to Moab, which was a land where the true God was not worshipped, where there was idolatry, in that land. They were an idolatrous land, right? An idolatrous nation. And we spoke of the time period in which this book is taking place. We said that it's right after Judges, and we know that Judges was a book and where everyone was doing what was right in their own sight. And God would establish judges, and those judges would then be corrupt. And so it was during this time where we're kind of during this period. So Elimelech ends up dying. His two sons end up marrying Moabite women, right? And they end up dying themselves. So the two sons and the father die. So all the male headship, all those the husbands, the ones that are supposed to be providing for these women, they've passed away. Doesn't say why they passed away, but we spoke on possibly the decision that he made to go to this land. So then, and Naomi hears that the Lord is returned back and is helping the people at Bethlehem. She decides, hey, I'm going to return, and she tells her two daughters-in-law to stay. And really, what we see is in chapter 1, we see this conversation, this back and forth between Naomi and her daughters-in-law. Her daughters-in-law were Ruth and Orpah. And we see them kind of going back and forth. And what we see at the end of it is Ruth's commitment to Naomi. She decides, hey, I'm not going to stay in Moab. I'm going to go with you. And Naomi advises her to stay, that this is where you're going to find security. This is where people know you. This is your land. So stay. Ruth decides to go with Naomi. So really what we see is Ruth's commitment to Naomi, even in a difficult circumstance. Understand, she just lost her husband, so it's definitely a difficult circumstance. And for her to go to Naomi, to a foreign land where she was going to be a foreigner, she's not a part of the Israel nation. Naomi was, so she doesn't know what she's going to expect when she goes there, but she goes anyway. And we see kind of the language in chapter 1, right? I think big thing that points out in verse 16, she says, "Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." So we had mentioned that not only is she following Naomi, but she's following the God of Naomi, and she begins. And what we're seeing is that Ruth is turning to the true God, and she's forsaking the gods of Moab. So that's recap from chapter 1. Last two studies we've been in. We started in chapter 2 and we finished in chapter 2 within 2 studies. So chapter 2, what we saw between verses 1 and 7, a new person is introduced. His name is Boaz, and Boaz is part of the family of Elimelech. And Boaz is a wealthy landowner. And Boaz meets Ruth for the first time, and he takes notice of her. She's over there. We spoke of how she was a foreigner. She didn't know. She proposes to go out and get some food for her and Naomi. Naomi's older, so she wants to do the heavy lifting. So she goes out. She doesn't know where she's going to land. She ends up, and we spoke of the sovereignty of God in the midst of this. She ends up landing in Boaz's field, which happens to be Elimelech's family. Boaz takes notice of her in verses 1 through 7. And then in verse 8 through 16, we see kind of an exchange, the interchange between Boaz and Ruth. Right? Verse 13, Ruth is overwhelmed. Why is she overwhelmed? Because Boaz says, "Hey, you can stay in this field. You can glean from my field. You can take as much as you like." And he makes it as easy as possible for Ruth to get to collect wheat and barley, so that she can feed herself and she could feed Naomi. And obviously Boaz has heard of Ruth, of her commitment to Naomi, of her kindness to Naomi, and this is what draws Boaz to Ruth. Ruth is like overwhelmed by Boaz's generosity. She's expressing gratefulness and gratitude. She understands who she is. She calls herself a foreigner. She says, "I'm not like your maids. I'm not even your maidservant for you to even be treating me like this." So this was a big deal that Boaz was treating her in this way. And we spoke of her gratefulness stemming and cultivating from who she was in light of how she was being treated. Right? She was by no means deserving of what she was given by Boaz. And then in verses 14 and 15, we see that Boaz invites Ruth. So not only does he say, "Hey, come and glean from the fields," but come and eat with me. Come and eat with my workers, and come to this party. So he's showing a sign of acceptance on behalf of Boaz, and he wants all his other workers to accept her like he's accepting her, because she's going to be gleaning there for the rest of the season. She's going to be getting her food from there. And then verses 17 to 23, what we see is the exchange between Ruth and Naomi. Ruth returns back to Naomi. She shows her all the toil all the work that she had done. She shows her that she's collected an ephah of barley, And Naomi's excited. They're both excited. And they break out in praise to God for providing, right? And we see kind of a change in Naomi's attitude. Remember that in chapter 1, Naomi is bitter, and when she returns to Bethlehem, she says, "Hey guys, call me bitter because essentially like I've gone through nothing. Like I left to Moab with everything, and I've returned back with nothing. So like the Lord has taken everything away." Now we see Naomi's changing her attitude toward God and how she views God, and she's praising God for blessing Ruth and her. So we spoke of all this kind of plays into how God's love isn't sporadic, right? His faithfulness isn't sporadic, right? Just like Naomi, we encounter, we go through circumstances, we go through trials in which it's difficult to see his hand. It's difficult to see that how he's at work, but he is at work. And he is present during those trials. The problem is our perception of God and his character in our trial. And it's not that his presence is not with us. It's just that we need to change our perception of who God is. And so now we get to the climactic point of the book, which is chapter 3. I'm going to break it up into 3 points. We're only going to get through 2 points, but we'll just go verse by verse and dig in. Before I do that, can someone read verses 1 through 15 of chapter 3?
Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing, and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city.
All right, so chapter 3 is broken up similarly to how, or structured similarly to how chapter 2 is structured. First thing we see is an exchange between Ruth and Naomi. They're engaging. Same thing happens in chapter 2. Then after that, we see an exchange between Boaz and Ruth. And it's the same thing we see kind of in the middle of chapter 3. And then Ruth returns to Naomi to kind of report back on what had happened. So I'm going to break it up into 3 points. First point being Naomi's plan for Ruth, which we see in verses 1 through 5. We begin in verse 1. So in verse 1, what we see is a shift on who's looking after who. Remember in chapter 2, verse 2, who was looking after who? What?
Ruth was looking after Naomi.
Ruth is looking after Naomi. So now we see the flip side. We see we see Naomi looking after Ruth, right? And Naomi begins by calling Ruth her daughter-in-law, which altogether doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is a big deal. What she's doing is she's expressing her relationship and her bond between to Naomi, right? And expressing the bond that she has with Ruth, and vice versa. So Ruth is committed to Naomi, and Naomi, we're seeing, is committed to Ruth. We've seen it throughout the book, but we're seeing it even more now. And so Naomi asks this rhetorical question: Shall I not seek? Right? After all that Ruth has done for Naomi, it's her turn to return the favor. And what she wants to seek for is in most of our versions it says a place of home. She wants to find a place of rest, right? In the NASB it says, "Shall I not seek security for you?" Right? So after so much instability, after losing a husband, after traveling to a foreign land and going through and working hard, now what's at the forefront of Naomi's mind is, I need to help my daughter to get stable. I need her to have a family. And so she comes up, she wants her to move from instability to stability. And she comes up, before I go there, the irony is that Ruth had desired this for her in chapter 1, right? Someone read Ruth 1:9.
The Lord grant that you might find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept.
Right. So, what she had proposed is stay in Moab and find rest. Find yourself a new husband, and you'll find rest. And now what we see is she's actually like proposing another method to find her rest. She thought that they would find rest in Moab. It turns out that's not what God had planned. God had planned that Ruth would go with Naomi, and she would find rest within the family of Elimelech. So, question. So, has there been times in our lives or your life where you think God is going to work one thing, God is going to work out something in one way, but He actually works it out in a different way? Because that's what's happening here with Naomi. She thought that her daughters were going to be well off in Moab. It wasn't the case for Ruth. So, what have you guys had similar examples? Yeah.
Well, I see an example in the first chapter of Ruth, how Naomi's husband thought they were going to have security leaving Jerusalem, or was it Bethlehem, because of the famine, and it didn't turn out to be so good for him.
Yeah. Exactly. What about in practically or personally in our lives? Like, has there been moments where we planned it one way, but it turned out completely differently than what we planned?
I think it happens often. Mm-hmm. It's God's providence.
Yeah.
Also in salvation, you go in this direction, and He calls you, and you go to a different direction.
I thought maybe 3 or 4 times when we were in Richmond Hill that we were going to move to different churches, some places, and I really thought we were going. And each time at the last minute it would be shot down or somehow. And even when I came here to talk to them, and they told me no. So I honestly didn't think we would end up here. I don't know if we'll stay either, but I don't.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think for me, it's definitely comforting to know that although I don't have all the details, I don't know all the pieces, all the intricacies of how God is working everything, I take great comfort in knowing that He does everything for His glory and for our good, right? And I think during those times when we're finding it to be difficult, we're never gonna see ahead and like put ourselves in the shoes that we're actually in. In fact, most of the times, just like Ruth, I'm just like Naomi. I'm pretty sure she didn't think that she would be sending Ruth off to try and propose to Boaz. She didn't have that in sight after losing her husband and losing her sons. She didn't have that in sight, and many times that's the case with us. And it's amazing to kind of look back, having matured in our ways and in our mindset, and to look back and to see how God got us to where we're at, and to look back and to look at the journey that He brought us. He brought us through to get us to where we're at. And I think that's what we need to kind of, remind ourselves of to kind of continue to propel through those difficult circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, like even practically, career-wise, job-wise, like we always think, this would be my career at whatever age. I know that happened with me. For example, like I would have imagined myself at a different career this point in life, like maybe a few years ago, but clearly it wasn't in the Lord's plans. So He kind of keeps us from certain things for a reason. Like, and then later on, now that I'm here, I'm like, okay, well, it would have been a disaster if I was in that career, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, just practically everyday, decisions, changing job and things like that. It's just like we think this job is better for me or whatever it is, but in reality, the Lord really plans our steps.
Amen. Amen. So I would encourage you guys to, and I say this to myself, but to trust in the Lord, to trust in His sovereignty and His decree, So Naomi obviously doesn't see this coming, but now that she's there, she's heard the good news in the previous chapter. She's heard of Boaz blessing her. She sets up this plot for Ruth to go to meet Boaz, right? So that he might take notice of her, not just simply take notice of her, because we already know that he's taken notice of her, but that he might take her into marriage. And it's Naomi's desire that it be well with Ruth, that it be well with her daughter-in-law. She wants her daughter-in-law to kind of, find a husband, and have another family. And so Naomi sets up this plot, right? She's seeking to fulfill the necessities of life on behalf of Ruth. She wants her to have food and shelter and clothing. She doesn't want her to work. Right now, they're kind of, right now, but aside from Boaz, they didn't really have anything to kind of stabilize themselves. So Boaz was kind of an answer to prayer by allowing them to glean, because now they have food. But she wants stability long term, and obviously this would be a concern for any widow. Even today, we have someone that's a widow that's dependent on the husband to provide, and the husband passes. Don't you think that person, that woman would be anxious on how she's going to pay the bills, how she's going to pay the rent, what is she going to do with her life? And so it was with Ruth. She most likely had some concerns, and she was thinking of these things, but she was putting the feet to the plow. She was doing what she had to do to provide as well as she could. But having a husband like Boaz definitely would have solved the problem of any concerns that she may have had. And so this is why Naomi sets up this plan. We move on to verse 2. And the first thing that Naomi does is she says, now Boaz is our kinsman, right? She reminds Ruth of the relationship that Boaz has with them, right? Part of the same family. And then he says, with whose maid you were. meaning this is the same guy that has been gracious and has allowed you to be with his maidservants. And she kind of, so she's stating kind of what's true, right? What Ruth already knows this. She knows that he's a kinsman. He knows that he's been gracious and that she's been able to pick and to glean from the field, and Naomi's just reminding her of this, right? Naomi's reminding her so that it would encourage Ruth to go to follow the command that she's giving her. I don't want to read the whole because I don't want to take too much time. But can anyone tell me what a kinsman is, or what the law was when a husband died and there were other members within the family available? Maybe Glenn. Where's Glenn?
Hiding right now.
Okay. What was the law?
Well, basically the law was that because they didn't want the line to end, that the close, usually it would be a brother, first and foremost, would marry the wife, have a child. The first child would be considered that man's child. Any child after would be his, but that would be his child, and he would inherit whatever lands or territory it was. And the idea was it would be continuing that line throughout. That's basically it.
Right. So you can read it on your own, but in Deuteronomy 25, we see at verse 5 through 10, we see the law established where it was kind of a protection so that the name of that family would not die out. And I'll read just a couple verses from it. It says, when brothers live together and when one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as a wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And then it goes on to kind of say the consequence if they don't follow this command or this law. So it was obviously to protect the family line of that person that died. And so that's what a kinsman was. And Boaz was this kinsman. He could redeem the family line of Elimelech.
Benny, just two quick examples would be when Judah's son first dies, and then Onan with Tamar, and then the last one is Sheila. He keeps giving, he gives his and he passes it down. And then when the Sadducees ask Jesus the question about if a guy has a wife and he dies, and then she marries the brother and he dies, and she marries like 7 brothers and they all die, whose husband is she in the resurrection? The same thing is he's playing on the kinsman redeemer, law.
Exactly. So any questions about the law of kinsmen? No.
Are you going to speak about why later?
Not today.
Okay.
Once we get to chapter 4. So Naomi is kind of presenting everything that's already evident to Ruth. And so what Naomi does is she says, hey, he's over there, right? He kind of points Ruth to Boaz's whereabouts. Boaz is winnowing barley at the threshing floor. And this was like an exercise of kind of cleaning house or filtering through everything, all the grain that they collected. They were separating the grain from the good and the bad. And that's what he was essentially doing. And usually they would do it either, it wouldn't be on dirt or anything. It would be on like solid ground, so that what they would do is they would, with a rake, throw it up in the air, and the wheat that was the heaviest would fall down first. Obviously, it's heavier, it's going to go to the bottom. That which was lighter would go to the top. So they would do this on like, solid ground, or they would go up to like a high point and do it so that when the wind comes, like the hill would kind of protect it from blowing away. So she's just saying, hey, he's over there, he's winnowing, he's doing this. This is at the end of harvest season where they're kind of collecting everything. And so that's what he's doing. And she's saying he's over there. She's trusting in God. She's trusting that, hey, God, you've been gracious to us thus far. I know that you will continue to be gracious. So he sends her. She submits. She submits to Naomi's request. And then we get into verses 6 and 7. Right?
I just have one question, Benny.
Yes.
The covering of the feet, like laid down on his feet. I don't want to throw a wrench in here.
Yeah. So,
It says uncover his feet. There was some kind of meaning in that. Or
yeah. So
something?
we'll get to it.
Right? Like,
We're gonna get to it. I mean, it's in the
it's a
next
type of
couple
Christ,
verses.
like,
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
I think it screams that out.
Yeah, we'll get to it right now. Just give it a second. Sorry. So verse 6 and 7. So it says, so she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded. Right. Not only does she say she's going to do it, she actually fulfills what she says she's going to do. Right. Ruth meant what she what she said she would do, and she did it. Right. She let her yes be yes and her no be no. She was a woman of her word. But not only was she a woman of her word, she was able to follow instructions. She was able to submit, even when the request may not have seemed most appropriate. And in verse 7, we see Ruth waits for Boaz to finish. This kind of makes sense. It makes sense why Naomi would tell Ruth to wait until he's finished. Kind of like, interrupting someone while they're working. Probably not going to go, the best if you interrupt someone while they're working. So wait until they get home. Wait until they feel rested and work is done and work is off their mind. And then approach. Yes.
I was going to say that also, back in those days, a woman had no rights. She was almost like a second-class citizen. So for her to be like a pushy female, that would doubly work against her. That would be the total disrespect altogether, the total, brash, the very wrong thing to do.
Right. And keep in mind this whole idea of, prostitutes would do this, and they would be seen. If he's working, that means she's gonna be seen by the other workers that are working with him. So this is one of the reasons why she tells her to wait. Yeah.
Prostitutes would pick up at the threshing floor as well, like in addition to the widows?
No. So they would go to the workers, and they would
Try to
sleep
entice
with them.
Yeah.
Entice them. So that was the passage that you had read. But also just the concept of the end of the day, once work is over, it's still true today, right? Like for those that are married and kind of the best time is probably after work is done. Usually when your spouse is working, they probably really can't talk. They're focused on work, and so it was the case with Boaz. Wait until he has eaten. And many times, at least for me, this is true. Once I'm like settled in, I think that's the best time to talk to me. If you didn't know,
Keep that in mind. Make sure you've eaten first. It's true though.
So Ruth waited just as she was advised to, and she comes. It says the verse says she comes secretly. Secretly doesn't mean that she was like a spy, but more so she came as quiet as can be, so that she would go unnoticed. And she was kind of like watching him to see when the right time was. So on her behalf, there had to be some sort of patience, right? Some sort of discernment on her part. She had to wait until she thought it would be a good time to speak to him. So that things could go smoothly. And she listens to the counsel of her mother-in-law, right? She's listening to an older woman that has proposed something, and she's obviously a wise woman, so she listens to her. And the passage doesn't really say, but it looks like she waited for Boaz to fall asleep. Well, it's kind of implied in the text that she waited until he fell asleep in the next verses. So she waits until he falls asleep, and then we get into verse 8 and 9. It says, it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your maid, so spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative." So verse 8, by the looks of it, Boaz is startled, right? And the original meaning of this word is that he's trembling. Could it be that, that his feet were uncovered? Could that be the reason why? And he's cold. Could that be the reason why he's startled and he wakes up in the middle of the night? Text doesn't say, right? Text doesn't really say why he's startled, but what it does point to is that she's gotten his attention, right? Because it says that he looks around and he sees this woman laying at his feet. And this is what Ruth has been preparing for, right? And take notice of how she identifies herself. She identifies herself as a maid, right? Obviously, it's a term of humility. For me to call myself a maid of someone or a servant, it's a term of humility. But how is this different than how she approached him in chapter 2 when she first met him? She considered herself a foreigner. Right, 2 different words, which means she's kind of her relationship and her mind has changed toward Boaz. Right, they have some sort of bond, and she knows it. And though she still says she's a maid, I think this is what kind of propels her, and this is what Naomi knows this. This is why Naomi mentions that he's a kinsman and he's already been gracious, so that it kind of propels her to go to Boaz and to have this confidence before Boaz. Although she knew she was a servant, although she knew who Boaz was, she went humbly but with confidence. And she never forgot who she was. So how does Boaz address Ruth? We see in verse 11. How does she address him? How does he address her? Sorry. My daughter. Right? And how do you guys think that affects how Ruth sees Boaz? How does Boaz's view or approach affect how Ruth views Boaz? Father figure, reverence, right? What else? Someone's calling you my daughter. If someone calls you my daughter, what are you thinking?
A term of endearment.
A term of endearment, yes. A term of close proximity.
This person loves me.
I mean, no one's gonna call you my daughter, but
Yeah.
so, but you guys get the point. It's a terminology of close endearment, of close proximity. There's a bond there, right? And I can just walk around and call everyone your daughter. You're gonna call those who you have a relationship your daughter. And you have dignity for that woman. Obviously, he knew she was a noble woman, and this is why he's approaching her. Since the beginning, he was approached her in this way, and he continues to approach her. So kind of to bring it to us, to apply to us, isn't that true that the more you see how God sees us, the more confidence we'll have when we approach God, right? If we see that God sees us as His children, all right, and He does, what will it do to our approach in Him? Obviously, we're gonna have reverence for Him, because a child should have reverence for their parents, but it establishes a bond, and it gives us confidence to go before God. Yes.
I was going to say, he shows how he imitates God. Where if you're a child of God, if you're one of His children, then you're a son or a daughter,
Yes.
depending on who you are. and he's showing, he sees something special about her. It just shows how, how God chooses who he wants for himself. How Boaz is a saved man, and he looks at things the way God does. And he's drawing I can't think of her name. Ruth. My mind is going. I can't. But he's drawing Ruth to herself. And if you notice how she does everything pretty much absolutely correctly, because she's being drawn by the Lord. Because if she only knew what the scriptures would say centuries later, how she's actually a foreigner, she's in the lineage of Christ. I mean, which is like, outstanding, It's like, it's beyond comprehension. How can somebody like her be drawn? But God chooses what he wants when he wants it.
It's just faith.
Faith,
Faith
yeah.
in the true God now.
Can I just add to that too?
Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting passage because adding to what he said, you also see it from her perspective when she says, "I'm your servant."
Yeah.
Some translations say, "I'm your slave." So in a way, we see that as Christians, we're slaves of Christ.
Yeah.
In the
Right.
same way, she's acknowledging that towards him.
Right. So proper perspective of how God sees us is going to help us to approach God properly. Not irreverently as sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't approach him because we don't have a proper view of who God is. We see our sin, we recognize what we've done, and we think that God is mad at us, that God doesn't want us to approach him. But having a proper view is going to protect us from having those false perspectives. Someone want to read, and this speaks to it, Galatians 4:3-7.
In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God.
Right? Reading that passage helps us to properly understand who we are before God. Reading passages, even the minor, the passages that seem don't seem relevant, like Romans 1:1, or all the epistles when we see how Paul addresses himself, a servant of God, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, a prisoner of Christ. And not only does he see himself that way, but he lives in that manner. And the more we have that perspective, like the more we identify ourselves with who we really are in God, the more the more rightly we'll approach him, but the more rightly we'll live. We see ourselves, I'm not just a man, I'm not just a husband, but I'm a child of the Lord Jesus Christ, and I ought to walk and live in a manner that demonstrates that. So this is what we see. We see kind of a shift in chapter 2 to chapter 3 of how she approaches him. She doesn't just see herself as a foreigner, but as a servant. And so she makes the plea to cover over her, right? Ruth is looking for Boaz to take action because of who she is. And she's saying to spread his skirt over her. And what it's used, it's used, if someone want to read Ezekiel 16:8, but it's used many times when it's to be taken into marriage. That's what it's typically used for. Someone read that passage, Ezekiel 16:8.
And I passed by you again and looked upon you. Indeed, your time was the time of love. So I spread my wings over you and covered your nakedness. Yes, I swore an oath to you and entered into a covenant with you, and you became mine, says the Lord God.
Right? So there's a relationship. And the word garment here, it literally means wings. Right? So he's saying, what she's asking, what her plea is and her request is, take me under your wings. Let me, as what was preached on Sunday, let me come under the comfort of your wings, right? Take me into marriage, marry me, and this is what the request actually is, seeking to take refuge under wings. And what's the irony here is that Boaz prays this same thing for her in chapter 2, right? Who remembers what Boaz prayed for Ruth? It's in chapter 2 if you don't know.
He says, under whose wings? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to, even though I wasn't here for this, but I believe it's verse 12.
Yep.
May the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you rejoice in full reward from the Lord God of Israel.
Yeah.
Whose wings you have come for refuge.
Exactly. So he's praying for her in chapter 2 that the Lord will bless her, that he would come for her. And then he actually is the feet. He's the means of the fulfillment of the prayer. Similarly to how Naomi prays, hey, I pray that you guys would find security in Moab. She's actually the one that's proposing Ruth to go and propose to Boaz and to find security in Boaz. So many times we are the means, we are the feet to our very prayers. Right? God uses us to fulfill what we've prayed earlier. And we have to be at his disposal in order for that to happen. We have to be willing to sacrifice our time, our monies, our efforts, to just sacrifice self in order to kind of be the means to God's grace in people's lives, in brothers and sisters' lives.
I like that.
So this is what we see after Ruth makes this plea. We move on to verse 10. Then he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether rich or poor." So we see Boaz's response to her plea, which is that she be blessed for her kindness. This isn't unlike Boaz, right? He just prayed for her in the previous chapter that she will be blessed. And the kindness that he's referring to is obviously the kindness that she's demonstrated to Naomi by coming to Bethlehem with her, by not forsaking, by gleaning to provide for them. But now he's taken it a step further. She's taken it a step further by having regards for the customs of Naomi, right? It was the custom of Naomi to get together with the kinsman, right? She could have easily followed her natural inclination, right? Our natural inclination is to get married with those of our age, right? To those that are that we most similarly relate to, and of course we're going to relate to those that are of our age most of the time. She could have easily done that by seeking a young man in marriage, which is what he's saying here. But she decided not to, right? Obviously, there's a disparity in age here between Ruth and Boaz, and we see that on how he addresses her. He calls her daughter because he's obviously older. So she decides to kind of continue to demonstrate her kindness, and he's kind of wowed. And that's why he says, "May you be blessed. You have shown your kindness better than the first." So you're continuing on. Move on to verse 11. "Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." So he goes on to say that he's going to fulfill her request. It's almost as if he's willing to fulfill this request. He's jumping out. He wants to fulfill this request. And And he gives the reason that Ruth has such excellent reputation that all the city knows that she is a woman of excellence. She's known in all the town to be a noble woman. She's like, when they introduced her to Boaz, oh, that's the woman that came with Naomi, that left her foreign land to come with Naomi. That's who she was known for. And obviously her reputation probably increased after going and gleaning for her family, going to provide for Naomi. So this is the reason why he kind of, he says, of course I'll fulfill your requests. I'd be glad to fulfill your requests. And he says, woman of excellence, and this, I think in some of your translations, it might say a worthy woman, right? Same word that's used in Proverbs 31. And what does it mean to, what's the main thrust of Proverbs 31? What does it mean to be a worthy woman? Fear of the Lord, right? What else? What are some other attributes that we get from Proverbs 31?
Because her husband good and not evil, I guess.
Right.
She works with her hands. She makes her poor at this time.
Right.
That's a family.
It's not even the idleness.
Right. Right. And so this is a woman that is selfless, right? Is noble. I'll just read a small portion of it. She is like a merchant ship. She brings her food from afar. She rises also while it is still night and gives food to her household and portions to her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. From her earnings she plants a vineyard. She guards herself with strength and makes her arms strong. So this is what she's known as. This is what Ruth is known as. And we've spoken about this before, but one person that is noble is attracting another person that is noble, right? And this is kind of like an easy relationship. So we move on to verse 12. Now it is true I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I, right? However, it's a stop. Although I want to, I'm doing what is right, and this is not unlike Boaz. Boaz does what is right. He's a noble man. He's a man of integrity, and he's following the law and the lay of the land, right? It kind of gives this news that's sort of like a heartbreak. Like, hey, there's actually someone first in line, and I'm second. So we have to follow the rules here. And he says, there's a closer relative than I. So Boaz, verse 13, we'll stop here. It says, remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. Just that portion, I'm sure, just to even say that, coming from him, I'm sure it's like he's being stabbed in the heart saying that. Like, yes, he's willing to give her up because that's the law, but I'm sure he doesn't want to. I'm sure he wants to take her into marriage right away, but he's being he's a man of integrity, and so he's following. He knows that there's an order to things, and so he wants to follow that order. He wants to be faithful to follow the order, right? And so it is when people are courting. When a couple is courting, you may have desire for that person, and those desires are not necessarily bad, but within the confines of marriage, and it is those that are noble and those that want to obey God's law that strive to keep themselves from marriage, that strive to be holy, that strive to set themselves apart. And this is what Boaz is doing. He's striving to remain committed, to do things in order. So he tells her, stay here. There's no reason for you to go anywhere else. It's dark out. You're safe here. Stay here until the morning, until we get this sorted out. And if this man wished to redeem you, then let him redeem you. But if he doesn't, I will take you and I will redeem you. So that's where we'll stop. But I do want to go into just the takeaway, right? Just going through this passage, we need to be praying that, similarly to Ruth, we would seek to be led by the Spirit. The proposal by Naomi wasn't an easy one, but she followed, she submitted, she obeyed, and she recognized who she was in light of God, or in light of Boaz. And we need to recognize who we are in light of God, right? Recognize that we are children. And we need to pray that just as Ruth demonstrates herself as a worthy woman, likewise as Boaz, we also need to demonstrate as worthy men and women of excellence, right? So that we would attract, especially for those that are single, we would attract those that are noble, right? It's not a coincidence that Ruth and Boaz seem to be blessed by one another. It's not a coincidence why Boaz doesn't even think on taking Ruth into marriage. They're attracting one another because they share the same characteristics. They both are noble. And pray that, and we'll kind of hit on this more next time, pray that as we're carrying out the will of God, that God will give us patience, right? It took patience for Ruth to go and to do what she did, to wait out till he was sleeping, and then to do what he did. It takes patience for we're going to get to this, but Naomi's kind of on the other end. She just sent her daughter-in-law off. She doesn't know what's happening. So she has to be patient herself and trust that the Lord is going to do what she thinks he's going to do. And he's going to continue to be faithful. So pray that even though we're uncertain of the outcome, pray that God will give us patience to do the will of God, and to remain, calm and comforted in Him. So that's what I have. Any questions before we close out? Yes.
I think when she brought up the whole thing with the sandals being taken off, I don't know if you addressed that yet.
Did you say the
clothes covering?
Did you say the clothes?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that I went over that. So that was yeah. Right. Garment literally meant wings. So what she was essentially proposing or asking is, let me come under your wings. Let me be comforted by you. And essentially she's saying, marry me. She's proposing to him. So if you need an idea on proposing to someone, there you go. Any other questions before we close out?
Might end up in jail.
All right. I'll close this out in prayer before.